In the beginning there was the One, all-knowing, all-powerful, all alone in this formless and infinite void. And so, choosing to fill the world, he created life. And so the One created Tamrit, and he was given dominion over all positive matter. For a time, this is how things remained. However, soon Tamrit found himself longing for a companion, as all living things do. And so the One would create Nati, and gave her dominion over all antimatter, and soon presented her to Tamrit. And these two would be given the names Primordials, meaning born before time. Just as man and woman become one in marriage, so did Tamrit and Nati. And from this unison a great force was unleashed, pouring out and filling this empty void in its entirety. This was the zeroth universe. And the One saw this, and it was good. In their unison, Tamrit and Nati had borne many children. The first two and the mightiest among them were the Ancient Ones. And Seal took after his father Tamrit, as he had dominion over matter and creation. The second child and his twin sister Eris took after her mother. She bore dominion over erasure and antimatter respectively. Together the two maintained order and balance in the universe. The last of the children born of the unity of Tamrit and Nati were the Titans. 16 in all, they were powerful in their own right. Sharing traits from both parents, each could create and erase anything they wished. And so they created massive works by the way of stars and galaxies. Soon, this empty void was filled with many of these works in its entirety. As time passed, the Titans would soon retire themselves to their floating castles in space. In an effort to further better themselves, the Titans opted to relinquish their emotions. And so the 16 Titans came together, and soon we meet them. However, just as one cannot destroy themselves, the Titans could not so easily erase these emotions, and so opted to confine them to a physical form. And thus the two primal forces were born. Ammo was the primal of purity, virtue, and honor. Alongside her was Malice, the primal of wickedness, misfortune, and corruption. And so peace once again returned to the galaxy. However, unbeknownst to everyone, and evil lay lurking in the shadows. And so the peace ended. Then war broke out in the universe. Ammo and the remaining Titans fought against Malice and his corrupted Titans. The battle raged on for eons, neither side besting the other. After eons of battle, the universe lay bare and empty. But the fighting didn't cease, it only continued. Seeking to end this conflict, Ammo and her Titans all gathered beneath the feet of Ensil and Eris. The Titans then pleaded with their twin siblings and asked them to put an end to the conflict. However, the two declined. This was due to the fact that in their eyes, there was no real harm, and the world was merely going through yet another change. Seeking to put an end to the stalemate, Ammo had one more idea, and so she gathered the rest of the Titans and went to their grandfather, the One. She only asked that he bless them and give them the ability to overcome their Titan brothers. As their grandfather, who was he to deny them? And so, ready for the final battle, Malice and his Titans gathered, preparing themselves. And before them stood Ammo and her now newly blessed Titan. And the battle took off. But now with the blessing of the One, Ammo and her new Titans managed to tip the scales of battle into their favor. Space once again lit up as it did before, bright with millions and billions of lights of each Titan clashing against one another. Ultimately, they would still fail, and as a result would be imprisoned by their Titan brothers, as well as Malice for his role in the conflict. However, taking pity on their brothers, they instead decided to use their blessings to cure them of any and all involvement from Malice. Now freed from his influence, the Titans decided it was time to punish Malice, and as such, they banished him to another realm. This realm would be given the name Tenebrous, and it would be where Malice would spend the rest of eternity. And so a young Titan, with Malice in tow, would bring him to the edges of the event horizon of this new pocket dimension, ready to banish him for all time. However, in a quick turn of events, he turned and attacked him, who would then retaliate and banish him forever. Looking upon the empty and lifeless world that they had created, the Titans decided it was time to build anew. And so, seeking the aid of their older siblings, they returned to Eris and Ensil and asked them to help them rebuild the world as it was. The two twin siblings, however, had some advice for their younger siblings, and told them rather than building the world as it once had been, to create anew. And so they did just that. First creating a new realm for Ammo to now reside in. It would be named Lucides. As for the Titans, they now knew it was time for them to move on. And so, using their power, they created something new. They created 16 brand new universes, one for each of them to reside in and rule over. As a parting gift, each universe was set to orbit around their grandfather, along with his other two grandchildren, Ensil and Eris. And so each Titan retired to their own universes. However, the story is far from over, as now we follow behind one young Titan by the name Orion. This being the same Titan that had banished Malice to his dimension. And as we follow behind him, we must ask ourselves, what will come from this story? And so Orion found himself in a new, empty, and unfamiliar place. From this point on, he had free will to do whatever he pleased. So the only question that remained in the young Titan's mind was what would become of this empty void. And so, stretching his hand out, he created life. And with a wave of his hand, Orion had created life. This new being that shared the empty void with him was named Crete. He was given the ability, as well as the responsibility, of filling up this empty void with planets and stars. While Orion, of course, could do this himself, he longed to see what his creation would do, and how things would soon play out. And so the universe was once again filled up in its entirety by all of Crete's works. From suns, to planets, to moons, to galaxies, to black holes, to everything that filled it up. Orion had thanked his creation for his tireless work, and had now decided it was time for the two of them to retire to one of the many planets he had created. As the creator of all the planets and stars in the galaxy, Crete had also been the one to name each and every one of them. The name of this particular planet was called Earth, and it orbited one single star. However, before Orion and Crete could retire to the planet, there was still one more thing Orion had to do in order to ensure the longevity of his universe. And so Orion had created the 6 natural forces. These 6 bore the sole responsibility of ensuring the universe's longevity, as well as making sure everything was in balance. The first 2 from this group would be Crete and Des. In their part, they were responsible for growth within the universe itself. An example of this would be how once a star reaches the end stages of its life, Des comes in and destroys the star, in turn causing a supernova. In turn, the remnants from this explosion are then used by Crete, who uses her powers to create and birth new stars. And so the two ensure that the universe is always growing as well as always changing. The next 2 natural forces within this lineup would be Pei and Hao. These 2 were the embodiments of chaos and order, and as such were responsible for maintaining it throughout the universe. Being the living embodiment of chaos itself, Hao was the one responsible for all the disorder and confusion within the universe. However surprising, it was through this chaos and adversity that many species and humanity would continue to evolve and reach greater heights. This relationship, however, wasn't stable, and too much chaos could prove dangerous. Adversity can prove very beneficial. However, too much can prove very dangerous as a whole. Sudden changes in temperature, such as during ice ages, have proved very dangerous, and even more catastrophic events such as asteroid impacts can wipe out millions of species in a single day. And this is where Pei comes in. As she establishes order within the universe, she gives life a fighting chance to overcome all the adversity it faces. And so the last 2 of the 6 were created. They were the living embodiments of life and death itself, and were named Elif and Edith. As to be expected, the 2 maintained life and death within the universe, ensuring that there is a delicate balance between the 2 of them, and ensuring the longevity of the universe and its inhabitants as a whole. In addition to being the gods of life and death, they were also responsible for ferrying the souls of those who have passed into the afterlife. Those who lived good lives would find peace within Elif's realm, and those who lived bad lives would find nothing but torture and solitude within Edith's realm. And so it was, these 6 would be crucial to the longevity of the universe, as well as its inner workings. And so with these 6 created, as well as their positions being assigned, Orion had returned to Earth once again. and looking out to the pale blue sky, he raised his hand once more, and with a single thought, created life throughout the entire universe. And all throughout the universe, life began cropping up. And it was with this, Orion sat back and looked at his new world, and it was good. And this is the way things would remain for thousands of years. Humanity would continue to flourish and grow, and the natural forces would ensure balance was maintained within the universe. And from on high, Orion would sit and watch over his creations. As humanity continued to flourish, they founded many great cities, and Orion was often worshipped in many of them. However, Orion soon found himself estranged from the very beings that worshipped him. This was due to the fact that his life, as well as that of the natural forces, was too far removed from the everyday inner workings of humanity, and as such, only helped further distance them from their own creations. As a way to make amends, as well as bless humanity for all their loyalty, Orion had created them one final gift, in an effort to bring them closer together. Arriving in one of the oldest and most powerful empires of the time, Orion decided it was time to give humanity their final gift. And so the first part of this was creating something that humans could familiarize themselves with. And so Orion looked in the environment. And what did he find? He found 4 constants that existed within the world. These 4 elements being fire, air, plant life, and water. And so using this inspiration, Orion created 4 new beings to give to humanity. These 4 would be known as the Pures. And the first among them would be Raj. Created from the bellowing flames from a massive fire pit within the center of the city, Raj would become the pure of fire and the color red, as this color tied into his creation. The next spirit to be created would be Amar, created from the winds flowing around the city, and he would lay claim to the color yellow. The next to follow would be Ren. She was the pure of plant life and had claimed green as her color. And lastly was Lu. She was the pure of water, and thus had taken blue as her color. And so now brought into the world, the Pures finally went forth and introduced themselves to mankind. And picking up where we left off, the humans and Pures had created a closer-knit relationship than they had with Orion. And so the Pures went forward and decided to teach humans brand new things. Humans had utilized fire for thousands of years, and as such, used it for many different purposes, from producing light to keeping warm, cooking meals, and even using it to help fashion tools and weaponry. Reggie was truly and utterly pleased by all humans had accomplished with it. Likewise, Amar was very fascinated with how humans had used the wind and air to further their efforts to expand, such as using the air and riding on it with their sails and their boats, and covering great distances that they would not have been able to otherwise. In Ren's case, she was very pleased with how humans had cultivated crops in such a way that they would make sure they would not go hungry when food was low. And so she went forth and helped humanity to further these efforts. And so Lu went forward to meet with the humans and was pleasantly surprised by all they had accomplished with water, such as using it for transportation, digging massive wells to ensure that they had clean water, and even using it for irrigation for their crops. And this is how the relationship between Pures and mankind had begun, and it was a peaceful one. However, there was one issue. The two Pures, Reggie and Lu, had found themselves in a cycle of constant fighting, and humanity, as a result, was on the other end of it. Created from fire and water, red and blue, Mora was the pure of lightning and the color purple. Born from the anger and rage of the two peers, the storms that surrounded her reflected her personality. And off she went to greet them. And so, with Mora now frozen momentarily, and Lou back in the fight, the two peers now decided it was time to work together to take down this new foe. And so, with her rampage finally over, Mora was then invited by the two other peers to come back and introduce herself to the others. And once on top of this mountain home, the peers, after discussing it, realized that they could each combine their colors and in turn create more of their own. And so the next peer to be made would be Ange, the peer of greed and the color orange. And following behind would be Ro, the peer of earth and rock and the color brown. And so, with all combinations explored, these new gods were brought into the world and introduced to Orion. After meeting the new peers, Orion was very fascinated, as he hadn't even considered or thought possible that his own creations could fuse their colors and create more of their own. Wanting to see everything that was possible, Orion would decide to create two new peers. However, unlike the last four he had created, these two would be pulled from the very essence of him himself. And so Orion created Kuro. He was the peer of death as well as the color black. Following behind would be Shiro. She was the peer of life and the color white. And so, having created two new peers, Orion sat back. And as he sat in his throne, he wondered if the peers that he created could create more just by fusing their colors, he too could do the same. And so, using the remnants of black and white, he would create one more peer. And so Orion would create Gure. She was the peer of grief and the color gray. And so, with their creation, the three new peers flew off to find their other brethren. And so they flew to the mountain where the peers had made their home and introduced themselves, as well as meet all the other new peers that had joined the ranks. It was also with the addition of these new peers with their new colors that they realized they had even more possibilities. And so, very quickly, they took off again to create more. And so the first to fuse their colors would be Raj and Shiro as they took off, ready to combine. This new peer was Rosa. She was the peer of love and the color pink. Rosa would take traits from both her predecessors, just as the other peers had. In Shiro's case, Rosa would represent the love for all life, as there are many different forms of love. One can feel great love for their children, for their spouse, and even their pets. And taking it from Raj, love has the tendency to change. It can either be a very strong, bristling fire, or a very weak and crackling ember. And so following this, Ro would then find Shiro, and the two would then create their new fusion. Leaving a Sahara in the wake of his creation, the next peer would be Tanjiro, who was the peer of sand and the color tan. And so, back up top the mountain home, one last color fusion remained. And so it began. And so Clea would be created. She was the pure of tranquility and the color clear. And so this is how things would remain for centuries to come. And as they passed, the pures would watch humanity grow and flourish. They would watch the rise of kings and the fall of empires. It was during these long passes of time that the pures would observe the human families and grow very interested in the idea of children. Being immortal, they knew not the joys of growing up, nor the joys of having children and watching them grow up. And so it was over these long passes of time that the pures would act on this loneliness and father children of their own. And so the pures would have many children. They would be called partials, as they were half human, half pure. Because of this, their hair often took the same color as that of their parents, and these were their children. Raj would go on to father 3 children. The first would be Scarlet. She was the partial of the hearth and the home. The second child would be Day. He was the partial of the daytime, as well as representing the sun as it passed through the sky. And lastly was his son Merlot. He was the partial of embers and fireplaces. Following behind, Ange would only have 2 children. Her first would be Apricot. He was the partial of war and conquest. And her second would be Marigold, who was the partial of wealth and money. As will soon be apparent, many of the partials take a lot of traits from their parents, be it their element or what they represent. In Ange's case, being the pure of greed, her children have traits that relate to it, as Marigold is a partial who seeks only wealth, and Apricot as well, as war is really just a means to an end to acquire more wealth. In Amar's case, being the pure of wind and air, it stands to reason and is unsurprising that he had many, many wives, as well as fathering many children. His oldest and most favored one would be Daffodil. She was the partial of music and dancing, and often inspired many humans to pursue different arts. Following behind would be the twins, Dawn and Dusk, who herald the beginning and end of each day, alongside Day and their other cousin, Night. The next child would be Dandelion, who represented the north wind, as well as the cardinal direction itself, alongside Dajan, who is the partial of the east wind and the east cardinal direction. Following behind would be Tuscan, who is the partial of the south wind and the south cardinal direction. On top of this, he was also known as the partial with the longest hair, which he often boasted about. Next was Canary, who was the partial of the west wind and the west cardinal direction. And the youngest of the bunch would be Flaxen, who was the partial of tornadoes. Following behind, Ren would also have her own children. Her oldest would be Chartreuse, who is the partial of trees in the forest. Her next child to follow would be Sage, who is the partial of mosses. Next in line would be Fern, who, as his name suggests, was the partial of ferns. The next two would be the twins Basil and Juniper. Basil was the partial of herbs, and also was given the secondary title of partial of food by the humans. His twin sister Juniper was the partial of flowers, and in reality the two are not twins. Rather, they were born merely on the same day, but to different mothers. However, the two still don't mind being called twins and keep it up centuries later. And the youngest sibling born would be Clover, who was the partial of good luck, and she was often loved by everyone. Taking a page out of Amar's book, Lou went on to have just as many children as he had. Her oldest born would be Night, who was the partial of nighttime, and worked alongside his cousins in order to bring about the cycle of each new day. Her next oldest would be Lapis, who was the partial of rain, and was often a lifesaver to many farmers at the time. Working alongside Lapis would be her sister Teal, who was the partial of clouds, and together the two coordinated where the rain would fall. Cobalt would be the next child to follow, and she was the partial of the oceans and the seas. Next was Sapphire, who was often regarded by many to be the most timid and shrewish partial of them all. This may correlate to her being the partial of snow. Likewise, her brother Zephyr was the partial of ice, and he was often regarded as one of the most coldest and calculating partials of them all. The most aloof and the youngest was Cyan, who was the partial of mist, and was often found in the most randomest areas, doing the most randomest things. Mora will also go on to have children as well, and many of their personalities were very striking to say the least. The oldest was Iris, who was the partial of joy, and this may be related to the fact that her mother was the pure of electricity. The middle child would be Sangria, who was the partial of storms, and to say she was a hothead wouldn't be far from the truth. And the youngest was Lilac, who was the partial of discord, and often created or found problems wherever she could. Following next would be a very peculiar situation, as Rosa was the only pure to meet, fall in love with, marry, and have only 3 children with one human man. And after his passing, Rosa swore to never take another husband, and has kept that promise ever since. Their oldest would be Fuchsia, who was the partial of passion, and no doubt the same passion that the two had for each other. Their next child, Magenta, was the partial of intimacy, and the love shared between 2 people. And their youngest was Taffy, who was the partial of commitment that a man and woman shared together. And these 3 represented the 3 components that made up love, and in turn represented their mother. The next pure to have children would be Ro, who fathered Carib, who was the partial of mountains and canyons. And his youngest, Umber, who was the partial of pottery, and often regarded as one of the most creative partials. And seemingly following a pattern, the neutral color gods all only fathered 2 children. Tanjiro was much the same. His oldest, Fawn, was the partial of the beaches found all around the world. And his younger sister, Sepia, was the partial of all the deserts found around the world, known and unknown. Kuro would also father 2 children, his oldest being Sable, who was actually the partial of misfortune and the opposite of clover. And his youngest child, Obsidian, was the partial of souls and had the ability to guide them into the afterlife. Surprisingly enough, being one of the most timid gods, Gure would actually have 2 children. Her oldest would be Anchor, who was the partial of despair. As stated before, this may be due to the fact that Gure herself was the pure of grief, and often the children took many traits from their parents. In a similar vein, Gure would have another child, and he was the partial of guilt. Likewise, Shiro would only have 2 children. Her oldest would be Chiffon, who was the partial of vitality. She shared this trait with her brother Alabaster, as he was the partial of healing. And lastly, Clea would have children of her own as well. However, very uniquely, she is the only pure to have only 1 child, this being Opaque. Being the partial of apathy, it was very hard for her to relate to the other partials, and even the humans that prayed to her. It was during this time, with the creation of all these new pures and partials, that the humans and the pures would bring about a golden age. However, this wouldn't be to last. Picking up where we last left off, the world was in peace and harmony, and the pures and the partials had gotten along with the humans of the world. However, as time passed, an event would occur which would change everything. A new star would appear in the night sky. Unbeknownst to the humans, a large asteroid was on a collision course with Earth. Hundreds of thousands would die in the resulting blast. Like you, the humans wondered why the Pures did nothing to protect them. And the easiest way to explain this would be through an anthill. While the Pures were indeed created to foster a better relationship with mankind, at the end of the day, we're no more than ants to them. And just as we watch while others destroy anthills and do nothing, so did the Peers. As a result of this incident, many of the empires that remained and humans that survived banded together under one flag in order to take war to the Peers. And on marched this massive army to the mountain where the Peers had made their home, so large that they drank oceans dry and stripped the land of all life. After weeks of marching, the army finally made it to the mountain where the Peers had made their home, and far above the skyline, curious eyes watched. Looking down below, Raj only had one thought enter his mind, and that was how easy it could be for him to wipe out every human down there with little to no effort. However, he snapped himself out of his daze, and immediately remembered that regardless of humanity's intentions, at its base, it was due to their inaction. And so the peers congregated in order to discuss what to do regarding the situation, and a plan was hatched. And so they summoned the current ruler of the new empire that had formed, chosen to lead all the empires that had merged. This man was a very well-respected one. And so the peers gave him a portion of their powers, and he was now responsible for protecting humanity. And all the humans named him Father Earth. And so peaceful times once again returned to humanity. Using his powers, Father Earth helped humanity recover, as well as bring life back to a majority of the planet that had previously been wiped out. He would help by way of summoning rain to end droughts, stopping earthquakes, and finally, preventing the same disaster that befell humanity before. And for a long time there was peace thereafter. Empires grew, cities were built, and more people were born. However, far away, up above on a mountaintop, a lone man sits. Having protected humanity for hundreds of years, his mind had withered while his body had not. Having lived so long, he became disillusioned with his role, as he was exposed constantly to the worst and darkest parts of humanity, and often forgot why he was protecting them in the first place. And so, after years and years and years of torment of having to protect these ungrateful people, while they continued to plunder and steal and murder, his mind finally broke. And so, the earth was engulfed in flames once more. Seeking to now rule over humanity on his own, Father Earth started by obliterating countless human cities and extinguishing just as many lives. However, much time had passed since humanity had challenged the peers. Now they had ships and cannons and muskets and decided they would not back down and instead fight this new threat. And so this new army marched forward against their new threat, numbering in the millions. However, Father Earth decided to crush this hope, as he knew all the muskets in the world wouldn't do a thing. And soon enough, after defeating the humans' army, he moved on to their fleet. so Earth was covered by a global dark age. Much of the old knowledge was lost, the death toll too high to count, and so the remaining humans banded together and prayed to the peers, asking them to save them once more. So they decided to create a new being, one born from the earth. To begin, Rose summoned a pillar of pure porcelain. Next, Mora appeared and shaped it with her electricity, crafting every minute detail with perfect accuracy. Next, Amar went forward and blessed it with the breath of life. Next, Raju touched down, and he contributed his fire, as it was necessary to burn within one's heart. For Rose's part, she blessed this new being with the love to treat humanity as if they were her own children. And so, free from the stone and given a new life, this being was known as Mother Earth. And as all mothers do, she wanted to protect her children, so off she went. Appearing in front of Father Earth, she asked him what he gained from killing so many humans. He merely chuckled to himself and said the flowers were done arranging themselves, and as every gardener knows, you have to get rid of the weeds. With no other recourse, as his mind had fractured, Mother Earth decided it was time to start the battle. Due to the two being equal in every aspect, the battle raged on for countless days. While fighting in this crater, a voice called out to them, saying enough. It was none other than Raj himself. Before either could respond, he ordered Mother Earth to leave them at once, and she did. And so Raj stared down his old creation, ready to put an end to the bloodshed. However, Father Earth didn't intend to surrender at all. And so it was finally time for Raj to put him down. With Father Earth finally dead, it was time to finally start healing the world. And once again, special shout out to Lindsay for these 3 amazing drawings. I decided to finally color them in, and they came out great.
the man inside. I wanna hold you in the night. I wanna curl your sand.